Here it will be well to add the following consideration. We have already said that the first two truths of the Arya, with particular reference to the doctrine of thirst and of fire, may not be directly evident to modern man. He may be able to understand them fully only in special or critical moments, because the life he normally leads is as if outside himself. Half sleepwalking, he moves between psychological reflexes and images which hide from him the deepest and most fearful substance of existence. Only in particular circumstances is the veil of what is, fundamentally, a providential illusion torn aside. For example, in all moments of sudden danger, on the point of being threatened either by the vanishing of ground from under one's feet through the opening of a chasm or glacier crevasse, or in touching inadvertently a glowing coal or an electrified object, an instantaneous reaction takes place. This reaction does not proceed from the quote-unquote will, consciousness, nor from the quote-unquote I, since this part follows only after the initial reaction is complete. In the first moment, it is preceded by something more profound, more rapid, and more absolute. During extreme hunger, panic, fear, sensual craving, or extreme pain and terror, the same force again shows itself. And he who can comprehend it directly in these moments likewise creates for himself the faculty of perceiving it gradually as the invisible substratum of all waking life. The subterranean roots of inclinations, faiths, atavisms, of invincible and irrational convictions, habits and character, all that lives as animality, as biological race, all the urges of the body, all this goes back to the same principle. Compared with it, the, quote, will of the quote-unquote I, unquote, has, normally, a liberty equivalent to that of a dog tied to a fairly long chain, which he does not notice until he has passed a certain limit. If one goes beyond that limit, the profound force is not slow to awaken, either to supplant the quote-unquote I, or to mislead it, making it believe that it wills that which, in fact, the force itself wills. The wild force of imagination and of suggestion takes us to the same point, to that where, according to the so-called law of, quote, converse effort, unquote, one does something the more strongly, the more one, quote-unquote, wills against it. As sleep eludes one, the more one, quote-unquote, wills it, or as the suggestion that one will fall into an abyss will certainly cause one to fall if one, quote-unquote, wills against it. This force, which is connected with the emotive and irrational energies, gradually identifies itself as the very force which rules the profound functions of physical life, over which the quote-unquote will, the quote-unquote mind, and the quote-unquote I have very little influence, to which they are external, and on which they live parasitically, extracting the essential fluids, yet without having to go down for them into the heart of the trunk. Thus one must ask oneself, what of this quote-unquote my body can be justifiably thought of as subject to quote-unquote my will, to quote-unquote I will, quote-unquote my breath, or the mixtures of the digestive juices by which food is digested, to quote-unquote I will my form, my flesh, or my being, this man who is conditioned thus and not otherwise? Can he who asks himself this not go on even further and ask himself, my quote-unquote will itself, my consciousness, my quote-unquote I, do I will these, or simply is it that they are? We shall see that the Doctrine of Awakening actually asks questions of this kind. And he who is strong enough to force himself, in this sense, to go beyond illusion, cannot help arriving at this disconcerting conclusion. Quote, you are not life in yourself. You do not exist. You cannot say, quote-unquote, mine of anything. You do not possess life. It is life that possesses you. You suffer it. And the possibility of immortal survival of this phantom, quote-unquote, I, at the dissolution of the body, is only a mirage, since everything tells you that its correlation with this body is essential to you, and a trauma, an indisposition, a fainting fit, or any kind of accident has a definite influence over all its faculties, however quote-unquote spiritual and quote-unquote superior they may be. There are some who, at certain moments, are able to become detached from themselves, get beneath the surface, down into the dark depths of the force which rules their body, and where this force loses name and identity. They have the sensation of this force expanding and including quote-unquote I and quote-unquote not I, pervading all nature, substantiating time, supporting myriads of beings as if they were drunk or hallucinated, re-establishing itself in 1,000 forms, irresistible, untamed, inexhaustible, ceaseless, limitless, burning with eternal insufficiency and hunger. He who reaches this fearful perception, like an abyss suddenly opening, grasps the mystery of samsara and of samsaric consciousness, and understands and fully lives anatta, the doctrine of non-aseity, of quote-unquote non-I. The passage from purely individual consciousness to this samsaric consciousness, which includes indefinite possibilities of existence, both quote-unquote infernal and celestial, this, fundamentally, is the basis of the whole doctrine of awakening. We are not dealing here with a quote-unquote philosophy, but with an experience which, to tell the truth, is not the sole property of Buddhism. Traces and echoes of it are also to be found in other traditions, both Eastern and Western, in the West particularly in terms of secret knowledge and of initiatory experience. The theory of universal pain, of life as pain, does not represent, in this respect, anything other than something completely external and, as we have already said, profane. Where it has been widely diffused, it refers only to the forms of a popular exposition. From the point of view of Western mentality, as a general outlook, two forms or degrees of existence in samsaric consciousness can be distinguished. One is truly samsaric, the other is limited to the time and the space of a single individual existence. The consciousness prevalent in the modern West is this second one. But this only represents a part, a section of a consciousness or a samsaric existence which stretches out across time, and which, as we have just pointed out, may also include states free from the temporal law that we know. In the ancient Eastern world, there still existed, in great measure, this much vaster samsaric consciousness, and the initiatory ascetic path, considered as an essential first phase, the passage from their particular consciousness that is bound to a single life, and defined by the illusion of the individual, quote-unquote I, to truly samsaric consciousness, a concept to which the notion of santana, of the quote-unquote I, as flux, current, or indefinite series of insubstantial states determined by dukkha, also corresponds. Only after mastering this phase can a passage be found to what is really unconditioned and extra-samsaric. But, as we shall soon see when we speak of the vocations, it is very rare in the West to find anyone who does not confuse the unconditioned, the absolute, with what are only higher states of samsaric consciousness.